It was a quiet afternoon in the small town of Elmsworth. The sun hung low in the sky, and the streets near the local grocery store were calm. People came and went, pushing carts, chatting, and enjoying the peaceful day. In the parking lot, a man in his 50s made his way slowly across the pavement. His name was Paul Granger. He wore a worn-out jacket and leaned heavily on a wooden cane. One of his grocery bags slipped from his arm and fell to the ground, spilling a few apples and a box of cereal. He bent down carefully, struggling to grab the items without losing his balance. Not far away stood Officer Mike Dalton, leaning against his cruiser sipping coffee. He saw everything, but instead of helping, he let out a loud laugh. "Move faster, Grandpa," he said with a smirk. "This ain't a nursing home." The sound cut through the quiet like a slap. Conversations stopped. People turned. A few bystanders froze in place, unsure what they just heard. One teenager pulled out her phone and hit record. Paul didn't say a word. He kept his head down, picked up his groceries, and walked off slowly. His face didn't show anger or sadness, just quiet. The officer watched him leave, still smirking, unaware that what just happened was about to shake the entire town, and that the man he just insulted wasn't who he thought at all. Mr. Paul Granger lived alone in a small neat house on Maple Street. The house was plain, with a little garden out front and a porch that creaked when the wind blew. Inside, the walls were filled with old photos and medals that no one in town ever saw. Paul kept to himself most of the time. He didn't go to many town events or join neighborhood gatherings. When people passed by, he gave a polite nod or a quiet hello. He wasn't unfriendly, just private. Neighbors described him as a quiet man who always looked careful when he walked. He moved slowly, leaning heavily on his cane. Some said he walked with a limp, though no one really knew why. To many he seemed like just an ordinary man with a hard time getting around. The local kids had their own ideas. To them, Paul was that grumpy old guy. They thought he was the type who would yell if they stepped on his lawn or made too much noise. They avoided him, whispering stories they made up to scare each other. Adults in town didn't know much about him either. They only saw him around the grocery store or walking to the post office. Nobody ever asked much. It was easier that way. But Paul wasn't just any man. He carried secrets hidden deep beneath his calm surface. He had lived a life filled with moments that no one around him could imagine. A life that shaped the man with the cane, the man everyone misunderstood. Paul didn't talk about his past. He never said why he walked with a limp, or what those medals meant, but soon his story would come to light in a way no one expected. 3. The officer's background and attitude. 250 words. Officer Mike Dalton was one of the youngest officers in the Elmsworth Police Department. He had moved to the town just 6 months ago, eager to prove himself. Mike liked to think of himself as tough and in control. He wanted respect, maybe even a little fear, from the people he served. At only 28, he had already earned a reputation for pushing the limits. Some said he was too quick to judge and a bit too rough when dealing with people. But no one had ever told him to slow down or be more careful, until now. Mike grew up in a different city, where the rules felt looser and respect was earned by being loud and strong. He didn't understand quiet people like Paul, those who kept their stories locked away. To Mike, Paul was just an old man taking up space, moving too slow in a world that demanded speed. He had no idea that the man with the cane was more than what he seemed. That afternoon, Mike was sipping his coffee, half distracted, when he saw Paul drop his groceries. Instead of offering help, he saw an opportunity to make a joke. He didn't think twice. But this small moment would soon spiral far beyond what Mike could imagine. Because sometimes, the smallest acts reveal the biggest truths. The teenager who recorded the cop's rude words wasn't planning to make a big deal out of it. She just wanted to share what she saw. Something that didn't feel right. She posted the video on social media with a simple caption, "Cop mocks disabled man, not okay." Within hours, the video started to spread. People from Elmsworth and nearby towns watched it again and again. Comments poured in, anger, disappointment, and support for the man with the cane. Why would a cop act like that? One person wrote, Imagine being that man and hearing those words, said another. Local news stations picked up the story. Suddenly the quiet town found itself in the spotlight. The police department issued a statement the next day. They said they were looking into the incident and promised to handle it fairly. But Officer Mike Dalton seemed unfazed. He told a reporter, "It's just an old man. People today are too sensitive." His words made things worse. More people shared the video and called for real consequences. Meanwhile, Paul stayed mostly quiet. He didn't want attention, but the world was closing in on him whether he liked it or not. The small town was divided. Some sided with the cop, believing Paul was overreacting. Others stood firmly behind the man they barely knew, demanding respect and justice. What no one expected was the secret behind Paul's limp and cane, a secret that would change everything. The police department couldn't ignore the growing storm. They sent an internal affairs officer named Detective Sarah Mills to look into the complaint. Sarah was known for being fair but thorough. She wanted to find out what really happened. She visited Paul's modest house one afternoon. The door creaked open, and Paul invited her inside with a small nod. The room was quiet, filled with soft light and old memories hanging on the walls. Sarah gently asked about the incident. Paul's voice was calm but steady. "This isn't the first time I've been treated like I'm less than," he said quietly. "People see my cane and think I'm weak." As they talked, Sarah noticed something on a shelf, a row of military medals, carefully placed in a wooden box. She asked Paul about them. For the first time, he shared a little piece of his story. Paul handed her a worn folder. Inside were his military records, documents showing years of service, battles fought and medals earned. There were photos of him in uniform, smiling with his fellow soldiers, but there were also medical reports showing wounds and injuries. Sarah's eyes softened as she read. Paul had been a Marine, wounded in combat while saving his squad. His limp and cane weren't signs of weakness, they were marks of courage and sacrifice. The more Sarah learned, the more she felt the weight of what happened in the parking lot. The disrespect wasn't just toward a man with a disability, it was toward a war hero. She knew this case was bigger than she first thought. The town had to understand who Paul really was, and Officer Mike Dalton would have to face more than just a complaint. Detective Sarah Mills returned to the police station with Paul's military files in hand. She knew this wasn't just a simple case of rudeness anymore. The chief of police, a stern man named Chief Reynolds, took one look at the documents and sat back in his chair, silent for a long moment. "This changes everything," he said finally. "We don't just have a complaint about an officer's behavior, we have a situation where a veteran was disrespected. Someone who served this country and paid a high price." Officer Mike Dalton was called into the chief's office that afternoon. At first he acted like it was no big deal, smirking and brushing it off. But when Chief Reynolds placed Paul's military records on the desk, Mike's expression changed. His confident smirk faded, replaced by shock and guilt. "I didn't know," Mike stammered. Chief Reynolds looked at him firmly. "You didn't ask, Mike. And you certainly didn't show any respect. That kind of behavior is unacceptable, especially towards someone who served." The chief's voice was steady but full of disappointment. "You're suspended, effective immediately. Until further notice." Mike nodded, the weight of his actions settling on him for the first time. He wasn't just facing a suspension, he was facing the truth he had ignored. Word spread quickly through the department. Some officers shook their heads, others quietly supported the decision. The town was watching closely. For Paul the news was bittersweet. He wasn't looking for sympathy or praise. But maybe finally, he would be treated with the respect he deserved. Once the news broke that Paul Granger was a decorated war veteran, everything in Elmsworth changed. The video had started as a story about a rude cop, but now it was about honoring a man who had sacrificed so much for his country. Veterans groups from nearby towns reached out. They sent letters and flowers to Paul's door. Local newspapers ran stories about his service, sharing photos and tales from his past that no one in town had known. Neighbors who once avoided Paul now smiled warmly and stopped to chat. Parents told their children about respect and kindness, using Paul's story as an example. Even the kids who used to think he was just a grumpy old man started to look at him with new eyes. One day, the principal of the local high school called Paul with an invitation. They wanted him to speak at the school's Veterans Day assembly. At first, Paul hesitated. He was used to staying in the background, not sharing his story with crowds, but after some thought, he agreed. Maybe it was time for people to hear who he really was, not just the man with the cane, but the hero behind it. The town waited, curious and hopeful. They were ready to listen and learn. What started as a painful moment of disrespect was turning into something powerful, a chance for healing and understanding. Paul's story was no longer hidden. It was becoming part of the town's heart. The day of the Veterans Day assembly arrived, and the school auditorium was filled with students, teachers, and townspeople. The room was buzzing quietly, full of curiosity about the man they thought they knew. Paul walked slowly to the stage, his cane tapping softly on the floor. He looked out at the crowd, took a deep breath, and began to speak. He told them about his time as a Marine, about the battles he fought, the friends he lost, and the injuries he carried with him every day. His voice was calm, but filled with emotion. He spoke about courage, sacrifice, and the true meaning of strength. Many in the audience were silent, some with tears in their eyes. For the first time, they saw Paul not just as a quiet neighbor, or that grumpy old man, but as a brave man who had given so much. Officer Mike Dalton sat quietly near the back, wearing plain clothes. He watched Paul speak, feeling a deep sense of regret for what he had said and done. After the assembly, Mike approached Paul. His voice was soft and sincere. "I'm sorry," he said simply. Paul looked at him, studying the young officer's face. Then he nodded and said, "Thank you for saying that." It wasn't a grand forgiveness or a sudden friendship, but it was a start. From that day on, things began to change, not just for Paul, but for the whole town. Respect grew where there had been judgment. Understanding replaced ignorance. And sometimes, that is how healing begins. After the assembly, Elmsworth wasn't the same. People started to notice more. The small struggles of their neighbors, the quiet stories behind every face. Paul still walked with his cane, his steps slow but steady. Now, when he passed by, people held the door open for him, or offered a friendly smile. It wasn't pity, they saw his strength. Officer Mike Dalton faced consequences for his actions. Besides being suspended, he was assigned to volunteer at the local Veterans Center. At first he was unsure, but over time, he listened to stories and learned what respect truly meant. Sometimes Paul would visit the center too, not to lecture or judge, but to share a cup of coffee and quiet moments. Two very different men, brought together by a moment that shook a town. In the end, what started as a cruel insult turned into a story about respect, courage, and second chances. Elmsworth learned that behind every face is a story worth hearing. And sometimes, it takes just one moment to change everything.